Joe still opened at 7, still cut hair with the same steady precision. But when customers asked about his day, he sometimes answered with more than fine. When the high school ROTC instructor brought his cadets by for regulation cuts, Joe found himself talking about discipline and attention to detail with an authority that surprised everyone, including himself. 3 months later, he received a letter postmarked Afghanistan. Martinez's handwriting was careful, her words chosen precisely. "Sir, we made it safe. The kids remember everything you told them, especially about carrying weight. It's helping. Thank you for showing us what 40 years of carrying looks like and why it's worth it. Semper Fi." Staff Sergeant Martinez Joe read the letter twice, then placed it in his cash register drawer next to the challenge coin. Evidence that some silences were meant to be broken and some stories were worth telling, even if it took 37 years to find the right audience. He still cut hair in the same corner barbershop, still kept mostly to himself, still preferred quiet to conversation. But when young people walked in, Marines on leave, kids heading off to basic training, anyone carrying weight they weren't sure they could manage, they sometimes left with more than a haircut. They left knowing that steady was possible, that carrying weight was manageable, and that some of the strongest people you'd ever meet might be hiding behind the most ordinary facades. Because sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons or won with medals. Sometimes they were fought with scissors and patience and the quiet determination to build something good from whatever pieces the war had left you. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, someone would walk into your shop and remind you that the weight you'd been carrying wasn't a burden. It was a bridge between who you used to be and who you'd chosen to become. Joe's barbershop remained the kind of place where conversation often died at the door. But now sometimes, the most important conversations were the ones that began there. When it was time to leave, each Marine shook his hand. Some said thank you, others just nodded, carrying away whatever they'd needed to hear. Martinez lingered after the others had filed out. "Sir, that was exactly what they needed." Joe was putting his tools away, hands steady despite the emotion of the morning. "They're good kids." "Yes, sir, they are." She paused. "Sir, would you mind if I wrote you?" From downrange, Joe looked up surprised. "You want to write to an old barber?" "I want to write to the Marine who just reminded 8 young warriors what steady looks like." He nodded. "I'd like that." After they left, Joe stood alone in his shop, surrounded by the familiar quiet he'd cultivated for 37 years. But the quiet felt different now, not empty but full, not hidden but earned. The challenge coin sat on his counter, catching morning light through the window. For the first time in decades, Joe Romano allowed himself to remember not just the weight he'd carried, but why he'd carried it. Outside, South Creek went about its business, but inside Joe's barbershop something had changed. The man behind the chair was still quiet, still careful with his words, still precise with his tools, but he was no longer hiding. Over the following weeks, word spread quietly through town. Not gossip exactly, but recognition. The insurance salesman mentioned it to his wife. The high school principal told a colleague. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop started bringing Joe coffee on Tuesday mornings, not because she'd heard anything specific, but because something in his bearing had shifted. At exactly 7 a.m., a military transport van pulled up outside. Joe watched through the window as 8 Marines climbed out. Young faces, nervous energy, the particular brand of confidence that came with training but not experience. Martinez emerged last, speaking quietly to her squad, gesturing toward the shop. The door chimed as they filed in. 8 kids, because that's what they were, despite their uniforms and their training and their determination to look older than their years, followed by Martinez. They arranged themselves awkwardly in the small space, uncertain why their staff sergeant had brought them to a barbershop. "Marines," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of rank, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Joseph Romano, Gunnery Sergeant Romano, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, Khe Sanh, Vietnam." The change was immediate. 8 young faces shifted from polite confusion to sharp attention. They might not know the details, but they knew the names, knew what Khe Sanh meant, knew they were standing in front of history. Joe stood behind his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 69 years. "Morning," he said. "Sir," they replied in unison, and something in their voices, respect, curiosity, maybe a little awe, took him back 4 decades to another group of young Marines who'd looked at him the same way. Martinez stepped forward. "Sir, these Marines are deploying to Afghanistan next month. Some of them have questions about fear, about holding the line when everything goes sideways, about coming home." Joe looked at their faces, young, determined, scared despite their training. The same faces he'd seen in mirrors and barracks and fire-base bunkers, the same faces that had looked to him when he wasn't much older than they were now. "What do you want to know?" he asked. The youngest one, a lance corporal who couldn't be more than 19, raised his hand slightly. "Sir, were you scared?" Joe almost smiled. 40 years since anyone had asked him that question directly. "Every day." "But you stayed." "We all stayed. That's what Marines do." A corporal near the back spoke up. "Sir, how did you deal with it?" "The fear, I mean." Joe was quiet for a moment, remembering. "You don't deal with fear," he said finally. "You carry it. Like your pack, like your weapon. It's weight, but it's weight you can manage. The trick is not letting it decide for you." "What if someone gets hurt?" another voice asked. "What if we lose somebody?" The question hung in the air, heavy with all the possibilities they were trying not to think about. Joe felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight he'd been carrying for 40 years. "You'll lose somebody," he said quietly. "Not might, will. And it'll tear you up. But you keep going. For them, for the Marines next to you, for everyone depending on you to do your job." Martinez was watching him carefully. She'd brought them here for this, not for war stories or tactical advice, but for the hard truths only someone who'd been there could tell them. "Sir," the young lance corporal asked, "how do you come home from something like that?" Joe looked at him, barely old enough to vote, about to deploy to a war zone, asking the question that had taken Joe decades to answer. "Slowly," he said, "one day at a time. You find something normal, something quiet, something that belongs to you, and you build on it. Every day you add one small thing that matters but doesn't hurt, until you have a life that's yours again." He gestured around the shop, the chairs, the mirrors, the simple routine that had saved him. "This isn't much," he said, "but it's mine. And some days, that's enough." They talked for another hour. Not about tactics or equipment or the glorious parts of military service that recruiters emphasize. They talked about carrying weight, about the Marines to your left and right, about finding purpose when purpose wasn't obvious. Joe told them about the Marine who'd carried him half a mile with shrapnel in his own back, about the kid from Ohio who'd shared his last cigarette the night before he died, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear their stories, and learning that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a challenge coin, Marine Corps emblem gleaming on one side, her unit insignia on the other. "Sir, would you accept this?" Joe looked at the coin, then at her. "You don't need to." "Yes, sir, I do." He took the coin, feeling its weight. It had been decades since he'd held one, decades since someone had looked at him and seen not the quiet Barber, but the young Marine who'd held a line when holding was all that mattered. "Thank you," he said. Martinez stood up, straightened her civilian clothes, and for just a moment Joe caught a glimpse of the officer she was, the leader who carried the weight of other people's lives and made it look easy. "Sir, there's something else." She paused. "My unit's deploying next month, Afghanistan. Would you mind if I brought some of my Marines by before we ship out?" Joe's hand tightened around the coin. For 37 years, he'd hidden from this moment, the moment when the past caught up and asked something of him. "They're good kids," Martinez continued, "but they're scared. And sometimes they need to see what steady looks like." Joe looked at himself in the mirror, 69 years old, gray hair, liver spots, hands that hadn't held a weapon in half a century. What could he possibly offer young Marines heading into combat? Then he looked at Martinez, and saw the answer in her eyes. It wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what he'd survived, what he'd carried quietly for 4 decades, without complaint, without expectation, without breaking. "When?" he asked. "Would Thursday work?" Joe nodded. "I open at 7. Martinez smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "We'll be here." She paid for her haircut, left a generous tip, and headed for the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Sir, thank you for your service and for—" She gestured around the shop, taking in the quiet space he'd built, the life he'd made from pieces the war had left him. "For this too." Then she was gone, leaving Joe alone with the weight of Thursday morning and a challenge coin he hadn't earned in 40 years. That evening, Joe did something he hadn't done since 1987. He called in sick, not because he was ill, but because he needed time to think, time to remember, time to decide whether Staff Sergeant Martinez was asking for something he could give or something that might break him. He climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment and sat in his kitchen, the challenge coin on the table before him. Outside, South Creek settled into evening routine. Teenagers cruising the main drag, families heading home from late dinners, the comfortable sounds of a town that had never heard incoming mortars or felt the ground shake from B-52 strikes. Joe had built this life deliberately, small, quiet, contained. After 2 tours in hell, he'd wanted nothing more than predictability. The same customers, the same conversations, the same safe distance from anything that mattered too much. But Martinez had walked into his shop and seen through 37 years of carefully constructed normalcy. Saw the Marine he'd buried beneath decades of "yes, sir," and "no, sir." And now she was asking him to be that Marine again, if only for one morning. Thursday arrived gray and humid, typical Carolina summer weather that made everything stick to your skin. Joe unlocked his shop at 6:45, 15 minutes early. He'd barely slept, spending the night alternating between memories he'd kept locked away and questions he couldn't answer. Would they respect him or see a washed-up old man playing soldier? Would his hands shake when young faces looked to him for wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed? Would 37 years of silence have erased whatever it was Martinez thought they needed to see? "This is outstanding work," she said. "Whoever taught you knew what they were doing." "Thank you." Joe was reaching for the hand mirror to show the back when it happened. His sleeve, loosened from the careful work, slipped up his forearm as he lifted his arm. Just for a moment. Just enough. Martinez froze. There, on Joe's weathered skin, faded but unmistakable, a tattoo. Not a typical barber's ink, not a young man's mistake. This was military. Old school military. The kind of tattoo earned in places that didn't make the evening news. An eagle perched on an anchor, wings spread, clutching arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other. Below it, barely visible but readable if you knew what to look for. Semper Fi, and dates that made Martinez's breath catch. Vietnam era, Marine Corps. Joe noticed her stare and quickly pulled his sleeve down, but it was too late. The moment stretched between them, heavy with recognition. "Sir," Martinez said quietly, "were you Marine Corps?" Joe's hands stilled. For 37 years he'd avoided this conversation. 37 years of rolled sleeves and careful angles and questions deflected with grunt acknowledgments. But something in the young woman's voice, respect, not curiosity, made him look up. Their eyes met in the mirror. "Long time ago," he said. Martinez straightened in her chair, not quite attention, but close. "What unit?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, still quiet but carrying weight it hadn't held in decades. 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, K. San. Martinez went very still. Every Marine knew that name, knew what it meant. The 77-day siege that became legend, the kind of battle that separated stories from history. "Sir," she said, and the word carried more weight now. "I'm Staff Sergeant Martinez, 2nd Marine Division." Joe nodded once. "Thought so. How long were you in country?" 2 tours, 67 to 69. The math was simple and terrible. Joe would have been barely 20 when he landed in Vietnam, younger than Martinez was now when he lived through hell and came home to a country that didn't want to hear about it. You were there for the whole siege? Joe's reflection looked tired suddenly. Yeah. Martinez had read about Khe Sanh in training, studied it in tactics classes. The remote fire base near the DMZ, surrounded by North Vietnamese forces, cut off for months, pounded by artillery and rockets. The Marines who held it became legends, but the cost was measured in names that never came home. Sir, how many— she started, then stopped. Some questions didn't have answers you wanted to hear. Joe understood. We held. 2 words that said everything and nothing. They held the base. They held the line. They held each other together when everything else fell apart. But what they lost in the holding was written in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he kept his past buried. Martinez sat in silence for a moment. The scar above his left eyebrow was faded, but visible. When curious customers asked, Joe would mutter something about a childhood accident and change the subject. The truth was locked away with everything else he'd never talked about. Tuesday started like any other day. Joe unlocked at 7, coffee brewing by 7:05. First customer arrived at 7:30. Bill Morrison, insurance salesman, needed his monthly cleanup before a conference. Nothing unusual. Small talk died after 5 minutes, replaced by the comfortable sound of scissors and the morning news droning from the old radio perched on the counter. By 10 a.m., 3 more customers had come and gone. Joe swept the floor, restocked his stations, and settled into the rhythm that had defined 3 decades of his life. Quiet work, simple work, safe work. Then, Staff Sergeant Maria Martinez walked in. She was 26, compact and athletic, with the kind of posture that announced military training before she said a word. Fresh off leave from Camp Lejeune, spending a week with family in South Creek before deployment. Her usual barber was booked, and her cousin had recommended Joe's place. Good morning, sir. You taking walk-ins? Joe looked up from organizing his tools. Young woman, neat civilian clothes, but something in her bearing made him take a second look. Yes, ma'am. Have a seat. Martinez settled into the chair and caught his eye in the mirror. Just a trim, please. Clean up the edges. Yes, ma'am. Joe pinned the cape around her shoulders and began working. Martinez was different from his usual customers. She sat still, not fidgety like teenagers or chatty like the older women who occasionally stopped in. She watched him work in the mirror with an evaluating gaze, like she was cataloging technique. You been cutting hair long? She asked. 37 years. All in this shop? Yes, ma'am. That should have been the end of it. Joe had perfected the art of minimal response, and most customers got the message. But Martinez wasn't most customers. My grandfather was a barber, she said. Army, though. Cut hair for his unit in Korea. Said it was good for morale. Joe's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. That's so. Yeah, he always said you could tell a lot about a man by how he held his tools. The comment hung in the air. Joe resumed cutting, but something had shifted. Martinez was watching him differently now, studying the way he moved, the precision of his cuts, the military straight part he was creating without conscious thought. 20 minutes later, Joe was finishing up. The haircut was perfect, sharp, clean, regulation precise without being obvious about it. Martinez ran her hand through her hair, checking the length. Joe's barbershop was the kind of place where conversation died the moment you walked in. Not because it was uncomfortable, but because the man behind the chair preferred it that way. 37 years of yes, sir, and no, sir, and nothing more. Until one Tuesday afternoon, when the wrong sleeve rolled up at exactly the right moment. Welcome to the human stories. Before we begin this powerful story of silence, service, and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Joe's barbershop sat wedged between a donut shop and a real estate office on South Creek's main drag, unchanged since 1987. Same cracked leather chairs, same faded photos on the walls of haircuts from decades past. Same silent owner who never talked about where he came from. Joseph Joe Romano was 69 years old. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he'd unlock his shop, brew his coffee, and wait for his first customer. The shop had 2 chairs, but he only ever used one. The other was piled with old magazines and newspapers nobody ever read. What people knew about Joe could fit on a business card. Never married, no kids, lived in the apartment above his shop, drove the same '92 Ford pickup he'd bought used 20 years ago, kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and cut hair better than anyone in 3 counties. What they didn't know was everything else. The regulars had their routines. Old Pete came in every other Thursday for a trim and complained about the weather. Tommy Rodriguez, the high school principal, stopped by twice a month and usually brought gossip Joe never responded to. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door would wave through the window, and Joe would wave back, the extent of their relationship. Joe wore the same uniform every day, dark slacks, white button-down shirt, and a black barber's vest that had seen better decades. His sleeves were always rolled down, even in summer. Even when the ancient air conditioner wheezed and gave up, leaving the shop thick with Carolina humidity. His hands were steady despite his age, never shook, never slipped. Customers noticed that. What they didn't notice was the way he held scissors, not like tools, but like extensions of his fingers. The way he moved around the chair with military precision, each step calculated. The way his eyes constantly scanned the mirror, watching not just the haircut but the street outside, the entrance, the exits.